Welcome back to Factorio. I'm currently in hell, getting the lay of the land to try and figure out just how bad the world generation is, given I did set cliffs to 200%. Oh look, here's one of the natives. The cliffs are, in fact, quite bad. That's fine, they won't be a problem for long, but before I sort that out, I need to make a foundry and some bullets, so I'm going to mine some rocks to get tungsten. I had the foresight to bring some basic supplies with me, which is really going to help to get things started. Other than that, it's the usual gameplay loop of furnaces and plates. I just realized I brought solar panels with me, so I can make the far superior electric starter smelter. That's much better. Now that I have a few plates, I need to make tungsten carbide for the foundry, so here's that. I know it's not very diagonal, but I don't really care since I'm going to dismantle this in like 2 minutes regardless. While I'm waiting for the carbide to craft, let me explain why cliffs are not going to be a problem. The answer, of course, is this big guy. He and I may not agree on what territory belongs to who at the moment, but we are united in our hatred of cliffs. Anyway, back to the starter factory. I'm collecting some calcite in a chest, so I can actually make things when I get the foundry, but before that I need steel and I need refined concrete. I brought regular concrete with me, so all I need to do here is refine it. Getting water on Vulcanus is more involved than on Nauvis, since you have to first make steam by neutralizing sulfuric acid with calcite, and then condense the steam to actually get water. But once you do that, everything proceeds exactly the same way as normal. You can also use acid neutralization for power, but I'm not going to get to that yet. The first thing I want to make to start out is more foundries, since you can't really do much without them on this planet. They allow you to create free metal from lava and have a crafting speed of 4 with a flat 50% productivity bonus. On planets where ore isn't free, the foundry's productivity bonus is absolutely absurd, since it stacks across every step of production. A case in point would be making the 6 science packs on Nauvis. 90 science per minute of each in vanilla requires over 11 yellow belts of iron ore and 8 belts of copper. With foundries, this reduces to just under 4 belts of iron and 3 belts of copper, a decrease of over 50%. I'm storing molten iron in pipes because I frankly forgot fluid tanks were a thing and it didn't occur to me to use them. It's not really a good solution, but it works. I'm throwing the stone straight into lava since I don't need it right now and it stops my molten metal from backing up. Now that I have a few more foundries, I'm going to make a ton of bullets. As for why I need bullets, I want to have a little discussion about the land that the Southwest Demolisher is guarding, since it has tungsten on it, and I'd really like to be able to use it to make science. I'm going to do that before building the factory, because the first thing I really want to do is make more foundries, and getting that automated without having to go mine rocks every 5 seconds would be nice. I'm using red ammo because it's free, and damage per second is king when fighting Demolishers due to their high health regeneration. In the meantime, I'm remote piloting a tank down to the uranium patch to unlock uranium processing, namely so I can research nuclear power and use steam turbines for power on the Vulcanus. I don't really care to set up nuclear power on Nauvis right now, but on Vulcanus it will be incredibly helpful. Since I have some time to kill while I wait for bullets to craft, I'm going to address the other problem I'm facing on Vulcanus: cliffs. There are far too many of them for my liking. Power at the starter base shuts off every night because I don't have accumulators, but the Vulcanus day-night cycle is so short that it arguably doesn't really matter. Here's the tungsten patch I mentioned. To demonstrate what I'm about to do on a much larger scale, let me place down some furnaces. The local Demolisher is not too happy about this, but the real reason I'm interested in him is that in addition to destroying my furnaces, he can destroy cliffs. See, who needs cliff explosives when the local population is more than happy to help without the need for pesky research? I'm essentially playing a relatively dangerous game of Snake, periodically interrupted by having to shoot the Demolisher again to remind him that he's still mad at me. The only real disadvantage of this approach is that it takes quite a while, but I'm waiting to accumulate bullets anyway. I want to remove the cliffs around the lava lake, and have more than a sufficient number of bullets now, so I'm deconstructing the starter factory to avoid it getting destroyed if I die to the Demolisher. Two hours or so after arriving on Vulcanus, I've removed a satisfactory number of cliffs. There are now no cliffs at all anywhere near where I want to build, much better than the cliff hellscape it was when I got here. After making some turrets and taking the extras from the space platform, all I need to do is set them up and fill them with bullets. I've also made a few poison capsules to help somewhat offset the Demolisher's regeneration. With that set up, I just need to summon the worm. I'm not sure why, but that didn't get me the achievement. This won't be the last Demolisher I kill though, so that's fine. With that, I should actually build the factory. I'm starting out by making molten iron and copper in a central location where I can easily dump the stone. With the new, less janky fluids, I can easily add more as I need them. One foundry for each metal should do for now. And here's the calcite. I'm planning for a second foundry for each metal because it can't hurt to overproduce a little. I've decided to send over red circuits and electric engines from Nauvis since I don't really want to set up coal liquefaction without big drills. Coal isn't that rare, but I really just want to build this once and be done with it. With a few big miners in hand, I can mine some coal. I'm actually making this one 45-degree diagonal since the mining area is so large that I'm more limited by the drill size than by the belt layout. It's in principle laid out the same way as I would do it in a straight factory, just with a few more belts. Because I'm using blue assemblers, I need to figure out how to actually lay out green circuits. The ideal ratio would be one plate foundry and one cable foundry for 3 assemblers, but getting that laid out in a diagonal form factor is going to be quite difficult. On that note, I'll figure that one out later. I'm just doing 2 assemblers for now. This isn't the main green circuit production anyway. I just tried to connect lava as an input to the copper wire assembler, which obviously did not work. Tungsten carbide production is pretty simple. It just needs access to coal, tungsten ore, and sulfuric acid, which makes you one of Vulcanus' 2 main products, along with tungsten steel, which is used to make artillery and turbo belts. Unfortunately, I forgot that the coal needed to be processed into carbon to be used to make carbide, so I had to rework the design a little bit to add some chemical plants. I'm inputting tungsten from a chest for now, since this will not be my final carbide production. With that semi-automated, I can at last reliably make foundries. I'm stockpiling some basic resources, including steel and gears, because there's no disadvantage to large buffers on Vulcanus, and I'd rather have them accessible when I need them for inserters and assembly machines. The only way to get oil on Vulcanus before automating Metallurgic Science is simple coal liquefaction. In addition to coal, this recipe requires sulfuric acid and calcite. Compared to regular coal liquefaction, simple coal liquefaction produces about 30% less heavy oil per input coal, and no petroleum or light oil, making it obsolete the second you unlock the other recipe because of how inefficient it is. I'm automating solar panels because I've decided to use them to power my first Vulcanus base. This is an objectively worse solution than acid neutralization, but I don't really care because solar panels are buffed on Vulcanus, and it's not like I'm short on space or materials. I also figured I'd do it here since I'm not planning on using solar at any other point during this playthrough. I haven't automated accumulators yet, so my base still shuts down every night. I'm getting miners onto my recently liberated tungsten patch so I can eventually belt the tungsten over for science, foundries, and belts. I don't really need very much of it right now, but I want it automated so I can periodically shuttle it to the carbide factory. I don't actually have enough belts to run it all the way to the base, but I'm blueprinting it, and I'll deal with actually placing them when I start automating science. I'm making batteries for accumulators because if I'm doing solar, I need my base not to black out every 2 minutes. I'm also going to use them to make flying robot frames. With that done, accumulators are automated and I can set up real power. I've been asked about my solar array design process before, so I thought I'd show some of it. I typically design my solar arrays focusing on a desired pattern first, and then usually try and correct the ratios once I have a basic design laid out. I'm not particular about perfectly filling the space, since doing so is far more aesthetically restrictive. I discovered that a perfect 45-degree solar design ends up tiling too perfectly at this scale, and ends up not looking diagonal enough, so I've opted for an off-diagonal design in the name of overall aesthetic. My current goal still remains to fully automate foundries, which means I need to make concrete. Concrete requires stone, which is unfortunately only generated when making metal from lava. There is no way my metal consumption is sufficient to produce a reasonable amount of concrete, so in the name of progress I'm going to make molten copper, turn it into plates, and throw the plates directly back into lava. Concrete itself is quite simple though, and quite cheap since it can be made directly in the foundry with its ridiculous productivity bonus. Refined concrete is exactly the same as on Nauvis since it can't be made in the foundry, but the ingredients are so cheap that it doesn't matter. This base's spaghetti isn't quite as bad as on Nauvis because I'm not really making much of anything at the moment, but I'm already finding myself needing to move things around to fit the belts where I want them. I've set up circuit controls on this foundry so it will alternate between making iron sticks and steel for the refined concrete. The amount required of either is so small that there's no point having a dedicated building for each. Stone is technically the only product on Vulcanus that actually needs electric furnaces, as the bricks can't be made in the foundry. Other than that, they're completely obsolete here unless you decide to use them for purple science, and there they're an ingredient, so I'm not really sure that counts. I'm adding a second plate disposal foundry to ensure I'm burning through molten copper fast enough to have a consistent supply of bricks. I don't really expect this to be an issue, but I'd rather not have to fix it later, so I'm jumping the gun now. I've actually run out of belts, so I'm going to automate them. They can be made directly in the foundry, so there's no reason not to make them here, given all the components are readily available and aren't exactly expensive. The foundry's productivity bonus also applies to belts, which is mostly irrelevant given that everything is free on this planet, but I'm not going to complain. Engines are very easy to automate when you have foundries, since all of the components can be made directly from molten iron. I don't need a ton of them since they're only going to be used to make buildings, locomotives, and robots, so 4 assemblers should be more than sufficient. The only real obstacle to my building for the moment is my own poor planning. Electric engines need green circuits, but they don't need very many of them, so I'm just going to take them from the solar setup. Since nothing here needs to be produced in insane quantities just yet, I've managed to avoid the underground belt-heavy builds I was heavily reliant on Nauvis. With lubricant connected, electric engines are automated. I've made slightly better carbon production, so now I'm going to use that tungsten I harvested earlier and make some tungsten carbide to finally get Foundries fully automated. The tungsten carbide itself is a very simple build, reminiscent of typical blue circuit automation. I've realized I can get away with outputting this onto the same belt as the input, provided I move the carbon to the inside lane. Slight miscalculations aside, the carbon is done. And here's the Foundries. Similarly, here's big mining drills. I don't have red circuits automated on Vulcanus yet, so this isn't fully self-sufficient, but I have the circuits I brought over from Nauvis earlier, which should more than suffice for now. With that done, I'm making tungsten steel, which is crafted from tungsten ore and molten iron. I'm planning for 90 Metallurgic Science per minute, which is double my current Nauvis SPM, but with the Foundry in hand, revamping Nauvis Science to run at 90 SPM is pretty trivial. Metallurgic Science packs themselves are very simple to make, just require a substantial amount of molten metal. The real challenge is getting enough circuits to reliably launch them into space, since petroleum gas is in very short supply before you have access to better coal liquefaction. The Science Pack is a good summary of the production loop on Vulcanus. It is made from tungsten carbide, tungsten steel, and molten copper, meaning it requires both types of molten metal, coal, tungsten, and sulfuric acid, and thus uses every type of raw resource on Vulcanus. I didn't technically need to set this up right now, but this way it will build up a buffer and I can send a bunch of Science Packs to Nauvis the second I get a rocket going. Here is my terrible correctly ratioed green circuit production. This design is an abomination and required a substantial amount of trial and error to create, so I'm not even going to try to explain it. It's not even that complicated, the diagonal format is just so ineffective that even the most basic tasks become a headache. This design also needs long inserters, which slows it down somewhat, but I'm so tired of trying to get these belts to fit that I don't care anymore. Now that I have green circuits automated, I need to crack heavy oil all the way down to petroleum so I can make plastic. I'm not bothering to make this in a way that's robust or in any way expandable, since I'm going to tear it all down the second I get real coal liquefaction anyway. The pipe routing is a headache, but that's nothing unusual and pretty par for the course at this point. I'm going to set up some very light circuit controls because I can't crack all of the light oil since I do need to make rocket fuel. That said, I'm just telling this pump to turn on when there's more than 2,000 light oil in the tank and calling it a day. Again, I don't really care that this design is inefficient since it's going to get torn down in like 20 minutes, but unfortunately I do need to make a few rockets before I can set up anything better. Plastic is going to pull from the main coal belt. I'm overbuilding a little bit, but this should get me a red belt of plastic once I get a better source of oil. With that done, here's red circuits. This is the exact same design as the setup on Nauvis, the only difference being that the copper cables are made in a foundry. With plastic connected, the setup is essentially done. I'm routing the output, not even bothering to lane balance the red circuits properly since I'm producing so few of them that it doesn't matter. I've decided to attempt a different design for blue circuits since I'm bored of using the same cookie cutter design for everything. Trying to route the pipes, it is quickly becoming clear to me, however, that this is not worth my time, so I'm going to use the design again and be done with it. Hello there, friend. Is your patrol path in the way of my solar array? I'm going to need to be careful where I expand the solar array until I get rid of this Demolisher. Rocket fuel is no different than on Nauvis, although I am making slightly more of an effort to not build myself into a corner this time. Here's the rocket silo. The only thing I have left to automate at this point is low-density structures. I'm expanding the ever-growing solar field because the base has started to run out of power at the end of the night. I'm also adding more coal miners because I'm actually using more of it now. I've added more miners than necessary to saturate the belt, so I'm removing them. With that, I'm making low-density structures, which are the last item I need for the rocket. These are insanely cheap on Vulcanus since they can be made from molten metal in the Foundry, and with them done, that's all the ingredients for the rocket. Now I just need to request some science from Vulcanus and deliver it to the labs. Research, isn't it beautiful? Rush to space and logistic embargo are now done, meaning I can finally do away with two of the major handicaps of this run. Here's the Vulcanus base in action. I'm running out of molten metal of all things, so I'm making more. The only thing difficult about this is the pipe routing, and that's only because, as usual, I've not left myself enough space for expansion. Due to the pressing need for more copper, I'm getting rid of my plate disposal system. I have a feeling it won't be needed anymore. I've spent the past half hour designing this circuit thing to intelligently load mixed rockets, but I've just realized you can't automatically deliver mixed rockets, which defeats the entire purpose, so I'm going to begrudgingly allow bots to handle it. On that note, it's time I finally set up some roboports. Since I have all this concrete, I might as well pave the factory with it. Since I no longer have to avoid using buffer or requester chests, I can finally make a bot mall that doesn't require using tanks. As amusing as the tank solution is, it is hellishly annoying to set up, so being able to use the much simpler solution is a welcome change. To start, here's robot inception. The robots bring the supplies to make an ever-increasing number of robots. Parametrized blueprints are very useful for bot malls since you no longer have to individually assign conditions to every assembler and inserter, which saves a lot of time. Back on Nauvis, I can actually make those buffer and requester chests available to the network so I can craft some of the things I didn't put in the original tank mall. Namely, this includes repair packs, which my second space platform has been requesting for about 4 hours at this point, and I never bothered to set up before this. My original plan was to leave Vulcanus right away, since the bots now have the means to expand the factory autonomously, but I've realized I didn't actually send up enough big drills or miners, so I might as well stay here for now. Rocket production won't be running all the time, mostly when the science ship comes around or my main platform needs supplies, so I'm buffering the rocket components to accommodate bursts in production. I debated calling my new space platform Glebanus, but I settled for its Gleban time instead. However, I fumbled the keyboard and pressed enter before finishing typing, so for now it's just called It's Gleban. The bot mall is slowly expanding, like some kind of malignant growth. At long last, I can replace simple coal liquefaction with complicated coal liquefaction, which... yep, it's just a direct upgrade. As promised, I'm dismantling the entire old setup because I hate it and it needs to go. Fly, my minions, fly! I'm designing this away from the build because the bots are still clearing out the old setup. This design is going to be fundamentally the same as the old one, other than the different inputs. Instead of calcite and coal on the belt, it just takes coal, and instead of sulfuric acid, the pipes now contain both steam and heavy oil, which needs to be priority cycled back into the design to ensure it doesn't run out. For those of you who watched the Nauvis video, this design is just a slightly improved version of my original advanced oil processing. I didn't make the mistake of flipping the refineries on this one, so the pipe routing is actually intuitive rather than being an unexpandable mess. With the coal belt added, that's the finished design. Steam for liquefaction can be made with calcite and sulfuric acid. The steam can also be conveniently condensed into water for use in cracking. I'm going to leave a bit of space here in case I ever end up needing more steam for some reason, but that's pretty unlikely for now. With that, I can add refineries. I'm using a circuit-controlled pump to ensure there's always some heavy oil left in the system. The tank it's reading from feeds directly back into the liquefaction setup, so this should ensure it never runs out of heavy oil. But on that note...
Young Mr. Frodo here. He's cracking.
I'm proud of it.
The cracking setup is fairly simple and is pretty typical other than the fact that it's diagonal. Since we're using liquefaction, you need far more cracking plants than usual. The design I ended up with is pretty nice because there's even space for beacons between the cracking plants. I've limited the cracking in very much the same way as before, except I'm limiting the water that gets to the petroleum cracking rather than the light oil, due to my decision to connect it directly to the cracking plant. Since both ingredients aren't exactly in plentiful supply on Vulcanus, I'm not too worried about it. With that, oil processing is finally done, and I don't have to think about it anymore. Cliff explosives mean I can finally fill in the random holes in my solar array. With that done, I'm leaving my random trash behind and getting off this planet. Back on Nauvis, now that I have Foundries in hand, I can finally improve my science production. With Rush to Space complete, I can automate yellow and purple science. This importantly means I can unlock some very useful technologies that I've been without up to this point, including portable fission reactors and Mark II power armor, as well as beacons, better assemblers, and turbo belts. Although there is technically nothing stopping me from leaving Nauvis right now and going straight to Gleba, the promise of better personal equipment is simply far too appealing to ignore after being restricted to Mark I power armor for over 15 hours. This does mean that once I do go to Gleba, I can set it up much more quickly, given I'll have access to more and faster personal robots, and it will as such be a much more pleasant experience overall. I also want to rebuild the other basic sciences using Foundries, since the productivity bonuses will significantly reduce the drain on my dwindling resource patches. As I mentioned earlier, Foundries alone allow you to reduce ore consumption on Nauvis by over 50%, which is very attractive as I'd like to avoid setting up any new outposts until I've beaten Fulgora. Before I can actually set up the new science, though, I need to be able to fit it into the labs, which is a tenuous proposition at best at the moment. I originally designed this setup to fit 8 science packs, which was fine at the time, but once I start bringing in science from Gleba, this design will no longer be sufficient to research all of the science packs at once, meaning I need to somehow fit another input belt into this already horrible design. It doesn't really matter what cursed solutions I have to use to get this to work, as long as I do get it to work, though, since agricultural science unlocks the biolab, which will allow me to tear down this god-awful setup in favor of a much better, longer-term design. But until then, I need this somewhat functional. If you were expecting the science I'm about to build to be a wondrous marvel of diagonal factory engineering, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Although the new science will likely be much better than the mess that was my first base, mostly owing to productivity from Foundries, I'm not going to be putting any major effort into making it expandable or actually focusing on design quality at this stage. This is mostly because, like Foundries, electromagnetic plants are very good at motivating complete redesigns, and I'll probably end up tearing this whole thing down again in about 30 hours after I beat Fulgora. I could technically build everything in anticipation of beacons and electromagnetic plants, but that's enough of a hassle that I'd rather just deal with it later. At this point, I really just want to get to Gleba. That said, I'm almost done routing the belts, and I just need to connect the final lab, and then I can start building the new base. I'm planning to build the new science production to the left of the current base, mostly because there's plenty of space available there and it should make routing the science to the labs fairly easy. So on that note, I'm expanding the old train loop next to the mall to make room for single-directional travel. I'm trying to signal this intersection in a somewhat passable way because it does pull directly off my main rail line, but it's not terribly important since even after I build the new base I won't be using more than a few trains per minute of each resource. With the intersection done, I just need to finish the rail loop and then I can build the stations. The new rails are nice, but the rail planner really doesn't like making things unnecessarily diagonal, so I'm going to end up having to do it myself quite frequently. I'm opting for a loop design with the new requesters with waiting bays at both stations, so I can ensure there are always enough trains available and they have somewhere to wait when they get summoned. The waiting bays aren't really needed right now, but they'll be nice to have when I quadruple production in the next base expansion. I've realized that my old requester station is oriented the wrong way to work with this loop, so rather than adapting the loop, I'm designing a new station, which is long overdue at this point anyway. I'm currently designing the Iron Requester Station, which will be the first part of what will eventually be a pull-based train system similar to the Logistic Train Network mod, although I'm not going to deal with making the trains universal for the moment, as that is an unnecessarily complicated undertaking given my current ore consumption. This system is fundamentally going to be based on 3 parameters: maximum train limit, request amount, and request threshold. Train limit should be fairly self-explanatory, as it's just the maximum number of trains that can wait at the station without clogging up the main line. In this case, there are 2 waiting bays and 1 place at the station, so the maximum train limit would be 3. Request amount is however much of a resource you want the station to have available in buffers at a given time. Given a diagonal 4-car train stop can accommodate 32 chests, I usually set this to an amount equivalent to 320 stacks, or 10 stacks per chest. The last parameter is request threshold. The idea behind this is to not send trains to a station until the certain deficit is exceeded, and then send a sufficient number of trains as to exceed the request amount. This isn't that useful unless you're requesting partially full train cars, just creates a sort of hysteresis loop in your ore supply, but I wanted to get it set up as I will be using them later, especially in Fulgora. It's somewhat annoying to set up using circuits as it requires a small memory cell, but the design works and that's all that matters. I'm also setting up an indicator lamp to tell me if the stop is enabled, which will change to yellow if a train is on the way, and blue if a train is at the station. This is shamelessly copied from LTN because it's such a nice feature that I don't want to be without it at this point. With that finished, I've added the copper station as well, and the entire supply for the new science production is complete. I'm going to make all of the molten iron and copper in one place in this build, leaving enough space so I can double it if I really need to at some point, but 10 foundries should be more than enough for 90 SPM of all the Nauvis sciences. For both copper and iron, this setup should take in 2 full red belts of ore and a trickle of calcite and make all of the molten metal my heart could possibly desire. With the molten production planned out, I am running out of belts. Eventually I'll be importing all of my belts from Vulcanus, but I haven't unlocked green belts yet, and red belts are cheap enough with Foundries that there's no real point shipping them in when I could just make them here. I'm trying to leave enough space here that the pipe routing isn't too painful, and I'm going to bring in circuits for splitters using bots, but other than that, this design is basically complete. Given foundries don't consume ore particularly quickly when making molten metal, 1 input inserter per building is more than sufficient. I'm manually inserting some ore to get this jump started and produce the red belts I need to build the rest of the setup. Given the belts are actually being produced now, I can connect the rest of the setup. Foundries are huge, which makes this type of routing very easy. Similarly, here is the copper setup, which is exactly the same as the iron, I just haven't connected it to power yet. And with that, it's connected to power, and I don't need to think about molten metal for a while. The next thing I'm setting up is oil, which is going to use the same design as I made for coal liquefaction on Vulcanus, the only difference being that it doesn't need to be supplied with coal. I will be putting beacons in place of the belts because I don't need them and I'll need less refineries this way, but everything else is exactly the same. The ratios here are a little bit different, but it's nothing particularly interesting, just adding a few extra plants for cracking. I do have to figure out how to get this crude oil pipe through the base, since I would like to avoid having to bring in oil by train for the moment, and this remains the only source of oil anywhere near the base. The main reason I don't want to bring in oil by train is that it would require me to use barrels, since fluid wagons still can't be loaded diagonally, and as much as I've been fine with using those in the past, large-scale barrel logistics are a nightmare and I don't want to deal with them right now. When you start putting barrels on trains, if your stop priority isn't configured perfectly, you will quickly end up with too many barrels in the system, which forces you to either destroy a bunch of barrels or remove them from the system manually, neither of which are very convenient to do when you're on another planet, and I'd rather my science production not completely lock up while I'm gone. I do intend to eventually use barrels for fluid transport, but doing that without LTN scares me, so I'm not going to touch them until I set up the final base. With that, crude is connected and we have advanced oil processing. Production science isn't actually that difficult to make, but it does require a substantial amount of red circuits and steel, both of which are usually major bottlenecks in early bases. However, with foundries, this isn't really a problem with how cheap the productivity bonus makes everything. In this case, I'm making iron for green circuits, which I will then use to make red circuits. To avoid the awful belt routing I subjected myself to on Vulcanus, I'm just going to put the iron on a belt and feed the wire directly into the assemblers. Full direct insertion isn't really optimal for circuits anyway until you get the electromagnetic plant. One of the nice things about Foundries is that molten metal has virtually unlimited throughput given the fluid changes in 2.0, so you never have to worry about whether you can supply enough to meet demand as long as you're producing enough ore and have a constant supply of calcite. Plastic for red circuits is going to pull off the coal belt from the old base, because I don't really want to set up a coal requester just for plastic, and this should work for now. In principle, it's the same design as usual. I'm just not bothering to lane balance it since I'm producing much less than a full belt and it's getting side-loaded anyway. The red circuit factory is exactly the same as the one on Vulcanus, so there's not really much more to explain here. Everything in this base is planned for 90 SPM when upgraded to Tier 3 assemblers, so for the moment it will produce closer to 60, but that doesn't matter too much since that research is so close anyway. Like on Vulcanus, I'm belting in copper wire made in a single foundry because that's more than enough for my needs. There are two major sinks of circuits in Purple Science, the first of which is modules and the second of which is electric furnaces. You only need one of each for every 3 Purple Science packs, but since each item requires 5 red circuits, they get expensive quite quickly. I keep having to expand the steam setup since foundries draw quite a lot of power, but anyway, here's electric furnaces. I'm also laying out the smelting line for stone bricks, which I'm going to set up after this. I need 3 foundries worth of steel production to produce a total of 300 steel plates per minute for electric furnaces alone. This isn't a huge problem if you have foundries, but without them Purple Science will quickly starve an early base of iron. The big miners I brought over from Vulcanus are going to be very useful here. This isn't a particularly big stone patch, but the reduced resource drain combined with the mining productivity research I'll be getting very soon will allow this patch to last quite a while. Routing this as usual isn't great, but it works. I've side-loaded the stone so I can put the bricks on the same output belt, which saves me a decent amount of trouble since I don't have to resort to underground belt solutions. If you thought electric furnaces were bad, let me introduce you to rails. They take even more steel than the furnaces and craft so quickly that it's difficult to even get them out of the assemblers in a diagonal setting. Thankfully, since I'm not beaconing these assemblers, I can get away with the same solution as before. A single output bulk inserter is barely enough, but it works. 90 Purple Science per minute requires exactly half a red belt of rails, so I'm putting them on the inside of the belt and putting the finished Purple Science on the other lane. Since electric furnaces and modules need much less than a full belt between them, this makes the actual science production fairly simple. I'm just using a filtered splitter to get the Purple Science off the belt, and with the assembly line built, I can bring it down to the labs. With that, we're researching blue belts and Tier 3 assemblers. With that done, it's on to utility science. The main resource sink for yellow science is blue circuits. Similar to purple science, it doesn't require that many of them, but since blue circuits require 2 red circuits and 20 green circuits apiece, it similarly eats through your resources very quickly. Once I get the electromagnetic plant from Fulgora, yellow science will become quite a bit cheaper from the productivity bonuses which apply to every type of circuit. But for now, I don't have the electromagnetic plant, so I need quite a few green circuits. Similarly to before, plastic is being thrown in here wherever I can fit it. It doesn't really matter too much since there are only 2 inputs. Yellow science also requires low-density structures, but since you can make those in Foundries, they're far from the prohibitive cost they are in vanilla. They require iron, copper, and plastic, but since they use molten metal, you don't really have to worry about copper throughput, so it doesn't matter too much. You don't need that many red or blue circuit assemblers, but blue circuits do need access to a dedicated belt for each, as enough blue circuits for 90 yellow science per minute requires nearly a full red belt of green circuits. The only thing I have left to make for blue circuits is sulfuric acid, but that's not terribly difficult to make provided I can find the space to route the pipes. Sulfuric acid doesn't require a ton of input throughput, but it does require iron plates, and my belts aren't quite aligned correctly to make this work very well. My inventory also keeps getting filled up with junk items, but thankfully I have enough logistic bots in the network that I can just clear my inventory when needed. With that setup, I just need to make engines, which are needed for electric engines, which are needed for the flying robot frames that go into yellow science. Thankfully, you don't actually need very many of these, so a few foundries and assemblers is more than enough. I've decided to use the same direct insertion solution as I did for my first Nauvis base, because I like it and it's easy to set up. With that, I just need the assemblers for yellow science. The power plant is now consuming the full red belt of coal it is being supplied with, so I'm adding a second line of steam engines to allow for another input belt. Here's the flying robot frames. Robot frames need batteries, but I can just take sulfuric acid off the blue circuit line and iron and copper from the readily available pipes, so setting it up is pretty trivial. It has occurred to me that I need to move the yellow science factory over by 1 tile, since I can't quite fit the output for the robot frames in with the way it's currently set up, but with that moved over it should work perfectly fine. I'm trying to cram the science production into a space it wasn't originally designed to be crammed into, which is a bit of a headache, but this should work fine. I'm using the same output solution as with purple science, which is a splitter filtered for the science pack. With that, yellow science can actually be crafted. I set up a buffer chest a couple of hours ago on Vulcanus to build up a buffer of tungsten plates because they're needed for artillery. With yellow science working, I can research robot speed and better personal equipment. I'm starting to run out of red and green science at the old base, so I'm just going to get the jump on it and build the new production before it runs out. Since almost everything here can be made directly in the Foundry, it's very simple to set up. When I was building this, I was so eager to be done with it that I forgot that belts could be produced in a foundry, so there's a small amount of iron unnecessarily being wasted here. That being said, the amount of iron being wasted is something like 13 iron ore per minute, so it's negligible and doesn't really matter. All I really have to do here is route the iron to the foundries and then it's done. At this point, I'm just finishing red science automation. Red science is incredibly simple and thus takes almost no time to set up. With the science done, it just needs to be routed to the labs. It isn't particularly complicated, and I'm just going to cut off the old production since the science is so cheap that there's no point trying to make sure it all gets burned. It's not like I really care anyway. After all, we're using like a belt and a half of iron ore for this entire base at the moment. I'm sending over some refined concrete from Vulcanus because I'm not making it on Nauvis and it's probably faster to get it from there. I need the refined concrete for exactly one thing here, which is the single artillery wagon that will get me the Keeping Your Hands Clean achievement. With that crafted, I just need to take a train over to an easily accessible biter nest and blow it up with artillery. I'm literally just going to destroy a single biter nest for the achievement, since I actually want nests readily available for biter eggs after I research captivity, and I'd rather not have to make a remote outpost specifically for biter eggs. Interesting. It seems that if you use artillery before triggering an attack by pollution, it gives you the achievement for triggering an attack by pollution, even though, as far as I know, artillery isn't technically pollution. With that achievement done, I'm basically free to leave for Gleba. However, my chemical science production at the old base is struggling, so I want to rebuild that first. Compared to yellow and purple science, blue science isn't actually that bad. It mainly just requires oil, and thus is difficult to make if you aren't prepared for it. Thankfully, I already have oil, and I'm already making plastic elsewhere in the base, so this shouldn't be too difficult. My coal outpost is no longer producing enough to sustain my power demand, so I'm going to upgrade it to use big miners. This is long overdue at this point, I just didn't feel like going out here to do it earlier. With that done, I just need to ensure I have enough of a power supply to run the coal miners long enough to build up a buffer again, so I'm manually inserting coal into the power plant. I'm also using some of the rocket fuel from the fuel station to help the process along, but with that, power should be fixed for now. Red circuits, as usual, aren't terribly complicated, and blue science requires quite a bit less of them than purple science, so it isn't really much of an issue. I'm using the same universal design again because I just need to get it working at this point, and I'm not exactly looking to innovate here. Since I made sulfur earlier, once I finish the circuits I just need to set up engine production, and then I'll basically be done with chemical science. And there we go, that's connected now. Engines are incredibly simple, and I'm not really going to dwell on them since I've already made them for yellow science and the principle is basically the same. I'm just laying the foundries out slightly differently. Belting in the pipes and gears requires a little bit of spaghetti given how I laid out the foundries, and I'm having to abuse underground belts a bit here, but as usual it should work, and as long as it works I don't really care how it works. Blue Science is unique as it's the only science pack on Nauvis that takes a really long time to craft, requiring over a dozen Tier 3 assemblers for 90 science per minute. It turns out I misaligned all of the Blue Science assemblers in my haste to get it done, but that's thankfully easily fixed and I don't have to tear anything down. With that done, I'm trying to figure out where to route the output belt, but I figure I can just run it through the purple science build or something, and that's probably fine. Other than the fact that I keep running out of inventory space, this works. Never mind, I appear to have ended up with electric furnaces on my science belt, but that's thankfully easily fixed. I'm going to remove the old military science to make routing in the new belt easier, since I'm just going to rebuild it in the new base anyway. And now we watch as the blue science begins to flow to the labs. At long last, research can resume. Speaking of military science, I'm going to need more stone. I'm going to use a priority splitter on the existing stone belt, so the stone will first go to purple science, but then to military science after that's backed up. I've built enough miners that this combined stone belt should be more than sufficient for both science packs. I'm laying out the furnaces wherever I can fit them, and sideloading the stone again to save me from using a separate output belt. All of the stone bricks are going to be turned into walls. Now I just need grenades, then I'll set up bullets. Grenades require iron and coal, but I already have both of those being supplied elsewhere in this base, so it should be pretty trivial to get them over here. Again, I'm really just routing belts wherever they'll fit, since I'm ready to be done with this build at this point. All I have left to build is a foundry for iron plates. With the grenades done, that leaves bullets, which I'm just going to tack on over here. You don't need very many of them. 2 assemblers for red ammo are more than sufficient. Military science is almost as cheap as red and green science, the main difference being that it requires more varied ingredients. With the output inserter set up, I'm again just using a filtered splitter for output. One of the other things I've decided to do before I leave Nauvis is set up uranium processing. I have no intention of converting Nauvis to a nuclear setup just yet, but I would like to get Kovarex enrichment started since that process takes a while, and I'd really like a portable fission reactor. For sulfuric acid, I'm going to fill a cargo wagon halfway with barrels and load and unload them directly from the train at both the mine and the main base. I'm setting up some pretty simple weight conditions, since this doesn't really need to be anything complicated. The train needs to travel back to the base when it runs out of acid or the cargo is full, and go back to the mine when it runs out of uranium. Since I'm only intending to ever have 20 stacks of barrels in this train, I'm just crafting them manually. My design for uranium processing and Kovarex is something of a sneak peek of the type of design I'll build once I start using beacons everywhere. It relies almost exclusively on underground belts, and is convenient since you can somewhat easily get 4 belts to a 3x3 machine. The design also gets coverage from 6 beacons and is tileable, making it quite convenient for endgame builds, especially after the buff to beacons in 2.0. It's also convenient because alternating assemblers output onto different sides of the belt, meaning you don't have to sideload anything in the middle of the build. This design obviously won't work for electromagnetic plants and foundries since they're larger, so I'll have to design something new there, but I'll be using this wherever possible for 3x3 buildings going forward. Making turbo belts is very straightforward, since the only difference between them and blue belts is that instead of requiring an absurd amount of gears, they require tungsten plates. Since I already have lubricant and ample iron production on Vulcanus, setting this up is very easy. Now that it's finished, here's the new science base in action. I'm sending green belts to Big Vulcanus, and I've added 2 extra rocket silos to make this process a bit faster. I'm not producing enough to supply these continuously, but the buffer fills up between uses, so it will be helpful for short bursts like this. With my 2 fission reactors and some extra exoskeletons and my power armor, I'm off to Gleba. asteroid composition around Gleba's orbit is different from Nauvis and Vulcanus, as it's mostly carbonic asteroids, so I'm not going to be leaving my ship there for extended periods until I set up asteroid reprocessing. Welcome to Gleba. I'd discuss my plans for this planet, but that would cause the surprise to spoil, and I don't have heating towers yet. In all seriousness, this video is getting quite long, so I'll be colonizing Gleba in the next one. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll release the next one whenever I find the time to get the editing done. Feel free to subscribe if you like this sort of content. On that note, goodbye for now.